Hello and welcome back. My name is Nicole, and today I'm sharing with you the most noteworthy fiction that I read in 2025. This is my list of the best books of the year. This is the sort of only year-end wrap-up I do where I talk about like my favorite books. I don't do a worst books of the year or anything like that. So let's just go ahead and get into it. I'm excited to talk to you about all of these books I have to mention. This year, I didn't go with like books by genre. I actually went with like books by category, like the books that most surprised me or were the most thought provoking. I tried to find just one for each category, but honestly, there were a couple of categories that I came up with that I just couldn't decide which was the best. And I'm just going to go through them with you, and I am going to end with the best book that I read this year. I have reviewed all of these books on my channel. So if you are interested in hearing more in-depth thoughts about my reading experience with these books, you should be able to search my channel page for the book titles, and the videos in which I talk about the books should come up for you. So let's go ahead and get started. The first category I have to mention is the best audiobook I listened to this year, and I'm not a huge audiobook listener, but I do occasionally listen to some, and in this case, from the very opening of the book, I knew it was going to be good. I mean, the book itself was good, and the book that I'm talking about is Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. This was a phenomenal book in and of itself, and the audiobook just took it to an entire another level. It was so well done, but not overdone, as I feel audiobooks sometimes can be, and it made it really exciting to listen to. There were multiple character voices. They were all done very well, but didn't feel like the book was being performed. It just felt like something I wanted to listen to and pick up every single day, and it definitely made listening to this book even more exciting than it would have been on its own, though I am still looking forward to reading the book as well. But I can definitely see this being a book that I would read and reread both physically and on audiobook. So if you have physically read this book, I highly recommend listening to it on audiobook as well. Or if you were interested in this book and just haven't gotten around to it because it is slightly longer, you might want to try using the audiobook if you don't typically listen or if you don't typically read longer books, because the audiobook makes it go by so fast. I did have 4 other books that I just wanted to include as honorable mentions that were also audiobooks that I listened to this year, and I also gave them 5 stars, not just the book, but the audiobook as well. That would include Their Eyes Are Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. I highly recommend this one because in her books she uses a lot of I dialect, and I found that the audiobook just made it easier to comprehend what the story was to begin with, because that can be a barrier to reading a book if the dialect in it is so heavy that you are struggling just to understand what's being said. Another series that I read that I enjoyed on audiobook was the Oz series, which includes The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. This was just a really delightful book. I listened to a couple of different audio versions of it and enjoyed every single one. I would highly recommend it if you're looking for an audiobook for adults or children. For nonfiction, my favorite audiobook that I listened to was The Overground Railroad. This is a really good nonfiction about the Green Book and its use by African Americans, and the audiobook really just drew you into the story, though this is an audiobook that I would say you're going to also want a copy of the physical book so that you can see the pictures of all the places that are being mentioned. And then the final book that I'm going to mention in this category technically isn't an audiobook, but it has a lot of audio experience that goes with it, and that is Year of Wonders. This is a book that I listened to, or well, really you read the book, but it's a book that takes you through a year of listening to classical music. And so as part of that experience, you do need to listen to the classical pieces for the full experience of the book. Oddly enough, the book itself doesn't have a website or any sort of like playlist that is dedicated to it, but there have been plenty of people who have saved playlists, including the dates of all the music to listen to. So I kind of felt like this semi-fit into the audiobook category as well. The next category I have was for the funniest book, and while I had a couple of different ones in mind, like Agalia's Daughter or Flatland, I ended up going with a later in the year pick, which was Romeo and or Juliet by Ryan North. This book is hilarious. It's a choosable adventure book or a choosable path adventure that takes you through kind of sort of the story of Romeo and Juliet. There are pictures in it. You go not from page to page, but from section number to section number in the style of choosing your own adventure, where, at the end of a couple of paragraphs or a paragraph, you get told to turn to another page number or another section number, and it's hilarious. I worked my way through the storyline a couple of times during my live sprints, and we were all enjoying. I was laughing so hard that I cried. And if you are looking for a fun way to re-experience Romeo and Juliet, I highly recommend checking this one out. It's also a really fun book for a day where you just need a palate cleanser and you just want something lighthearted to look at and read. I also really love large books like Mammoth's, books that are over 800 pages. And while I read 5 this year that I gave 5 stars, in fact, I think I read slightly more than 5 this year. I gave the vast majority of them 5 stars. I was actually quite happy with almost all of the Mammoths that I read this year, but I did have one that kind of outshone all the others, and that would be Stalingrad. This is definitely a mammoth of a book. It comes in at over 1,000 pages, I believe. Well, the actual text part is just under 1,000 pages, but it is well worth it. I loved this story. If you like War and Peace, I highly recommend this. Grossman intentionally modeled this story after War and Peace, and I think you can see the influence in it for sure. It is told in a more linear narrative style than War and Peace is, so I know a lot of people don't like War and Peace because they don't like how it goes back and forth between the story and what feels like essays. This is all story, and it is a gripping story that follows a family and their friends during World War II as Germany makes moves to come and conquer Russia. And it is just a story that makes you fall in love with every single character in here. And there are a lot of characters. There are characters to the point where I found a flowchart to use while reading this book, but it was so worth it. And eventually you do get a handle on the characters, but this is my favorite Mammoth read of the year. Next, I had a favorite series for the year, which is saying a lot for me because I am not always a huge fan of series and I never feel compelled to finish one. But this is a series that as soon as I started it, I knew I was going to want to read all 3 books, and I did. And I really enjoyed every single one of them. And that is the Xenogenesis series by Octavia E. Butler. I finished all 3 books and I did make sure to get the matching editions of them. So I read Dawn, Adulthood Rights, and Imago. And I just recently finished this one in the month of December. I would highly recommend this series if you like speculative sci-fi. I don't even know that it's really speculative, but if you like post-apocalyptic sci-fi that's not necessarily focusing on the post-apocalypse and isn't like the extremely stressful survival situation, but explores like how we would continue the human race after an apocalypse. I feel like that's kind of the vibes that's going on here. Anyway, Octavia E. Butler is great, and so far I would say this is probably my favorite series of hers. I don't know. I really liked the Earthseed books as well, but I feel like that one's slightly more traumatizing. So maybe this is the one by her that I can handle. I had a favorite hidden gem of the year, and I've talked about this book over and over again this year, so you probably know what it is. It is the work The Inevitable by Daniel Hope. This is a work of science fiction that is about Tuck, who is a sentient robot who is trying to find various parts that he needs to keep himself alive after the bot riots and war that has taken place on Earth. It was really good. I've talked about it a ton, so I'm not going to go on about it here. But if you're looking for a good sci-fi that has some cozy vibes, some adventure vibes, but is also really thoughtful, this is the one that I would go with. I reread quite a few books this year, especially ones from high school because I'm doing a high school rereading challenge with my friend Alex. But my favorite reread from this year is actually The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. And this is a book that we reread as part of that challenge. It was one that I was really hoping I would still find was good and enjoy. And I feel like enjoy is like really hard to say about this book. It's about the Vietnam War, but it is a really good book. And I did recall why I liked this book and what I appreciated about it. And it was, again, a 5-star read for me. I wanted to pick a favorite thoughtful book for this year, like one that really got me thinking and like from beginning to end. And I struggled to narrow it down. So here are my recommendations if you're looking for a book that is just really thought provoking. And by and large, they're from a couple of different categories and they're definitely all different in feel. The first one that I'm going to mention is To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. This book just hits you with a question at the end that I just thought was so profound and I still find myself thinking about every now and then. So if you're looking for a sci-fi that has some space exploration and isn't too long, this would be my recommendation. If you like philosophical fiction, I would go for The Tartar Step. I really enjoyed this book just as much as I was hoping to. It is a really strange sort of premise where there is a young man who goes off to his military career up in the high sort of mountainous region, and he is at a fort there with other men who have been waiting for forever for the enemy to attack. And there is just so much going on that has you thinking about what's real, what's not real, what's really happening. You get to see this young man over the course of his life, and yeah, it's slow paced but doesn't feel slow, and it's thought provoking. Yeah, I guess that's why it's in this category. On a different level, there is a work of speculative fiction that's also feminist fiction, and that's Agalia's Daughter. This was recommended to me by a long term friend who I know has great tastes, and this book lived up to it. I laughed and I cried in this book. I'm pretty sure I experienced every human emotion. It was well worth the read and so thoughtful. It looks at sort of gender role reversals and gender in general, just in terms of the stereotyping and what we expect of each other based on gender. And I absolutely loved this book. I would definitely read it again and highly recommend it. And then another book that I feel like was very subtle and allegorical in nature, and by that manner kept you thinking about what it was really saying, was Flatland. I feel like this is a short little work that I really don't hear much about at all, even amongst people who read a lot of classical literature. And I have to say, this is a work that I would recommend to anybody if you just want to think about class and society and structures, very similar in a lot of the themes to Agalia's Daughter, but from a different, very different approach, mainly having to do with geometry and shapes, which I think was a really fun way to explore ideas related to humans. I'm just realizing I forgot to pull one of the books off my shelf, but I'm going to go ahead and mention it anyway, and I will just put the book up on the screen because I'm running out of time. I have an appointment that I got to get going to. So I did want to include a book that I thought had the most beautiful writing. This is a book that I read at the beginning of the year, and it held up over the course of the year, and that book is Orbital. I feel like this is a book that's very controversial about people because some people are very frustrated because they feel like not a lot happens in the book, and that is pretty accurate. And I think they're also thrown off by the lack of characterization in the book in addition, which I don't think is totally true, but I do think the characterization is subtle. But what most people who like this book tend to like about it, and I personally loved about it, is the writing. Some people find the writing beautiful, some people don't. I personally did. I think Orbital is very similar to Be Taught If Fortunate, but I think if what you were missing in Orbital was either more character or plot, I would say read To Be Taught If Fortunate. I think if you liked Orbital and you liked the writing in Orbital, but you'd also like something else that has lovely writing in it, but gives you a bit more of a plot and more characterization, again, read To Be Taught If Fortunate. And if you enjoyed To Be Taught If Fortunate, I would definitely still give Orbital a try. Just be aware that it is more on the literary side of science fiction. Another category that I really struggled to pick just one book for was the book that most surprised me this year. I had a couple, and I'll just mention what my sort of runner-ups were, if you will. That would include The Street, The Inevitable, Agalia's Daughter, Fane, and Flatland. I think these were all books that I expected to like, and they're on this list in some way or another because I gave them 5 stars because I loved them. And that alone surprised me about the books. There were also elements within the books that surprised me, but the one I ended up picking for this category is XX by Ryan Hughes. This is a mammoth of a book. I had been putting it off for years. It's one of the books that I've been wanting to read for the longest time and have also owned for the longest time. And man, I regret putting this book off. It is another work of science fiction. If you haven't noticed, there's actually a lot of science fiction on this list. This was the year of science fiction for me. But I ended up really enjoying this book. And I think the reason I'm giving it the most surprising book of the year is because I, one, hadn't heard a lot about this book in general. And then when I did finally hear and watch a review about this book, it made me concerned because it was a negative review that made it seem like this book really wasn't about much and wasn't worth the time and effort. This book is worth the time, it's worth the effort. It's a really thrilling story, and I found it quite a bit of a page turner. It does go back and forth between like a couple of different storylines and then also some graphics. As you can see, it is a work of ergodic fiction, which means that there's different formatting throughout the book as part of the story. But I think unlike some other works of ergodic fiction where it's just like, oh, here's just an email or something, there is so much going on in this book with the way things that are formatted that tell their own story. Ryan Hughes is actually a graphic designer, and he wanted to see more of that incorporated into books, and he did that with this one, and I think he did an amazing job. I will say I don't think it's a work of science fiction that's going to interest everyone, but if you've been curious about it, at least check it out from a library or something. I know it can be a little bit hard to get a hold of, but if you can get a hold of it, you like science fiction, and you want something that is a really thought-provoking and interesting story, kind of on the hard sci-fi side, but gives you a lot to think about and look at, that's the book. I feel like because it's an accomplishment, I also had to include the biggest book I read this year, which should be no surprise if you're not new to my channel, and that was Clarissa. This was a reread for me. It came in at just under 1,500 pages, and I have read it, I have enjoyed it. It was not a 5-star for me, but it was the biggest book. And you know what? I read this whole thing over the course of the entire year, and I had to make it on this list somewhere. It is the best, biggest book I read this year. Is that kind of cheating to put it in that way? Maybe so. And the book that you may be waiting for, which is the best book I read in 2025, I don't know if this will come as a surprise to people or not, but for me, it was Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. I read this into January, beginning of February, and this book has staying power. I have thought about it probably every single month this year, either in relation to another book, just on its own, just thinking about the topics. It's the one book that like grabbed me at the beginning of the year and just never let go. And I remember even while reading it, just how impressed I was by every single moment in this book, by every single line, all the words. It's so thoughtfully written that you can just tell the amount of work that went into the writing and the editing of this book. Or if there wasn't a lot of work put into it, like this guy's even more of a genius than I thought. Either way, this was an immediate 5-star read and has held up over the year. I can say that by the time I get to the end of the year, when I look at my list of all my 5 stars, I sometimes end up being like, oh yeah, I forgot that I read that book this year. Or, oh yeah, I haven't thought about that book since I read it, even though it was really good. This book I knew was going to be on this list. I knew it was from the time I finished it that it was probably going to be my best book of the year. And I knew that anything beating it out was really going to have a hard time doing that, and nothing else did. So that's it. As I close here, I will put up on the screen for you a list of all the books that I gave 5 stars to. I'll scroll through my story graph so you can see that, and you should see all of these books on here, as well as a few others that I didn't mention, but I also really enjoyed upon reading. But these are basically my superlatives, or like I said, the ones that I found most worthy of note. And yeah, had fun doing this. I hope this gives you some ideas of what my reading year was like and what I enjoyed. And let me know if you've read any of these books and you have enjoyed them, or let me know if you hated them. That's always interesting to know as well. And that's it for me. I'm looking forward to 2026 and having a whole new list of favorites. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.